Last year, as the standing committee pondered over, prayed about, and discerned if bringing on a provisional bishop was the right decision for the Diocese of Milwaukee at this time, there were lots of things to consider. We knew that it would be a huge job for anyone, especially considering all the diverse needs that we had, and that the position would only be for a limited time that they would be with us. And so the person that we brought on would need to be someone who would hit the ground running. And a big part of that would be relationship building with clergy and parishes in a fairly expedited way. It was a tall order, to be sure, but the pondering and discerning and prayers were heard and paid off in the calling of Bishop Lee to fill that role for this season of our lives together. In a very little time, he has come into our diocese with warmth, enthusiasm, and an openness and commitment to collaboration with the laity and the clergy to envision together the future of our parishes and our diocese, what that might look like, and how we can continue to live into our mission in this moment. So I am grateful for his presence, the gifts that he brings, and for his willingness to journey with the Diocese of Milwaukee during our period of transition and discernment. And so it is my privilege to introduce for his address to the 174th Convention of the Milwaukee Diocese, the Right Reverend Jeffrey Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Jana. I am delighted to have been called to this work. It is really, as I've said in several other venues, it has really, it's a homecoming for me. The Diocese of Milwaukee figures prominently in my own life of ministry and in my prayer life in shaping me. And I'm very, very grateful to be here with all of you. And a lot of thanks I could lavish right and left at how generously I have been welcomed. So thank you for that. This address, I've never been able to figure out exactly what the difference is between a pastoral address and a sermon. So here goes. I think a word of encouragement is what I'm aiming for here, and a reminder of who we are. I told this story when I visited St. Boniface in Mequon. So if you're delegates from Mequon, I apologize for that. But it's an important story in my own spiritual life, so I'm going to share it with you. When I was planting a church in the Diocese of Indianapolis, Lisa and I moved there, moved into a house and had 12 people into our living room and started a church. That grew very quickly, I have to say, and one of the biggest challenges I've ever taken on. We moved from our living room, outgrew that pretty quickly, to a borrowed community room at a bank. This was in Fishers, Indiana, just north of the city of Indianapolis, and growing by leaps and bounds. We'd have had to have been lazy not to have grown, but we outgrew the bank building and then finally landed in a gymnasium at the local middle school. Every single Sunday, squadrons of minivans would pull up to that high school, middle school rather, and unpack totes and set up church. And when church was over, the squadrons of minivans packed it all back up and went away. It was a challenge. It was a lot of work. And I was full of anxiety, full of earnest intent to get this new church launched and to be the biggest and best Episcopal franchise that Indiana had ever seen. And nothing was ever good enough for me. And so I hit the wall a couple of years into this and fled to my favorite monastery in Boston for a retreat. I knew I needed to get some advice from the monks and to take in that peace and calm of the monastery. So I got there, trailing bits and pieces of myself all over Memorial Drive until in Boston and Cambridge, rather, before I got into the monastery, unpacked my bags, and met for the first time with the monk who was going to be my companion for the retreat. That's their custom, where you get somebody you meet with every day, a brother you meet with every day, to sort of check in about how it's going and so forth. So we had our first meeting, and we sat down in front of the fireplace. And I unloaded all my anxiousness, all my worries, all my desire to do my absolute best for God and the church, and all the things that weren't going just exactly right, and on and on and on and on I went. And he just sat there nodding occasionally and listening. Finally, when I'd exhausted all the worries and misgivings and anxieties I could think of, kind of exhausted myself in telling them, he finally spoke. And he said to me, "My goodness, you sure are occupied by lots of cares. You know, Jeffrey," he said, "I don't think this retreat is going to be quite so much about you." "Oh, not quite so much about you," he said. It is amazing to me. It has amazed me throughout my life how almost anything can be turned into a gigantic ego project. That's what I had done with this new church I was helping to start. It had become a gigantic ego project. Even legitimate anxieties and worries and fears can become an ego project. When we become transfixed by those things, they tend to multiply. I've said this again and again and again to myself first, and anybody else who wants to listen. What you focus on grows. What you focus on grows. The ego thrives on my deep-seated suspicion that it really is all up to me to win, to get it right, to be successful, to save the church, you name it. My ego really wants me to believe that it's all about me. Well, at least I'm in good company. Maybe you are too. Consider those first disciples, the original biblical keystone cops, the first friends of Jesus, always walking around in the duh zone, as a friend of mine says. I'd have written the Bible rather differently, by the way. I think I'd have cleaned up those guys. They wouldn't be quite so clueless, but I think God intended the scriptures to be honest, mostly, I think, for the benefit of those of us who find ourselves walking around in the duh zone. How many faceplants do you think Jesus had to? Philip, have I been with you so long and you still don't know who I am? Peter, really? Again and again. Very recognizably human characters. In that reading from Mark we heard this morning in morning prayer, this is how I imagine the scene. I imagine those disciples, led by the professional fishermen in the group, pulling against the storm. Jesus, apparently oblivious to it all, asleep in the stern. The disciples' fear is one most of us know from our own high-functioning egos. I bet. We're going to sink. We're going to lose. We're going to fall. We're not going to make the budget. The world we knew so well and had some sense of mastering, who knows what it's going to be like or if it will be there at all when this pandemic ends. Any of that sound familiar? The ego is a good thing, you know. It keeps me from walking out onto the street in front of a bus. But it does want to convince me that it's the only real thing about myself. The ego is a good thing. It keeps us safe from walking out into traffic, but it does want to convince us that it is the only real thing about us and that it really is all about us, but we know better. Do you know those moments when you're so captivated by someone or something you love deeply and your self-consciousness simply goes away? Where did the time go? You lose self-consciousness. We do frequently, and we don't cease to be. We know better. The ego is not all there is to us. It's a pretty stormy world, isn't it? Global pandemic, our blustery, fractured, violent political life, talk about ego projects. Economic uncertainties, social changes to make our heads spin, church attendance numbers in a tailspin. Crystal balls fail us. Did you know that at several prominent universities now, you can get a PhD in futurist studies? Folks in that field base their work on the observation that we live now in a VUCA world. That's the phrase, acronym they use. VUCA, V-U-C-A, stands for volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. Seems right to me. That's the world we live in. The church, this diocese, our congregations, all of us have entered a time of increasing uncertainty. As someone put it at our recent meeting of the representatives from the 3 dioceses in Wisconsin, whether we want change or not, change is upon us constantly, and it's unpredictable. Well, into all of this steps Jesus. The church stands rightfully in the midst of life, just as Jesus did. And Jesus did not promise us an escape hatch from the real world. Great theologian said, we crucified Jesus not because he was God, but because he claimed to be God and then failed to come up to our standards for assessing that claim. The thing we seem to have wanted from Jesus is to be fished out of our humanity, and that's the one thing God seems to refuse to do. Jesus didn't promise an escape hatch. He promised something much more than that. Not an escape, not magic, not anesthesia. No, he promised us peace. His kind of peace. The kind that can still the waves. Why are you afraid? He asks. Have you still so little faith? That storm on the Sea of Galilee was real. Those storms come up fast. It's a relatively shallow body of water. They can be dangerous, those storms. And it's not that there aren't very real dangers in this world, God knows. But it's not up to us to save ourselves. We can't. The promise of Jesus is that if we will walk by faith, and faith, makes a much better verb than a noun, like the word love. We talk about, if I only had enough faith. Had enough faith? How do you quantify faith? Faith is a way of behaving in this world. It shapes our decisions. If we will walk, if we will live, if we will breathe by trusting not in ourselves, but ultimately in the power of God, there is nothing in this world to be afraid of, not ultimately. That's the good news. It's the best news there could ever be. It's the faith of the church, the faith that gathers us here today. It's why we have to be together, even online. Our trust in the power of the living God is the only excuse for this beloved church with its budgets and buildings and clergy and committees and all the rest. I believe it's the only real justification for considering the possibilities before us, including a reunited Diocese of Wisconsin, which, by the way, is all that we have agreed to do at this point. News reports notwithstanding, all we have agreed to do is to consider, to ponder, to discern the possibility of reuniting. I'm enthusiastic about that possibility, but there's a lot to do before diocesan conventions could make such a move. So breathe. And the question at the heart of our discernment, for that matter or any others, the question at the heart of our life as church must be this: how will any of our decisions enlarge our capacity to live the good news of Jesus in this broken, beautiful world? How will any of our decisions enhance our mission of making real the mighty good news of God's endless love and mercy and power? Good news for a world that seems so captive to chaos and anger and fear. It's certainly what our baptismal promises are all about. That's why we recite them again and again throughout the church year. They are not complicated theological statements. They are not nuanced political platforms. They are straightforward promises about the choices we make in our day-to-day lives. Promises to turn away from our endless and deadly self-absorption. Promises to choose to live more and more like the Lord we follow. To live not for ourselves, but more and more like Jesus. For the lost and the least and the frightened. To make the peace of God real in this world, even just a little. That's our mission. That's how the winds are made to cease and the waves brought to calm, when we determine to practice the peace of Jesus, to respect the dignity of every human person, to seek and serve Christ in all persons, to work for a world of justice and peace for everyone, to share the good news of God's unfathomable love for everybody, that God will not rest until every man, woman, and child who lives has a place at the table of his love. Nothing less. That's our mission. So, let us commit ourselves to shape the life of our congregations, the life of this diocese. Let's commit ourselves to be a church which does not run away from the pain and confusion and chaos of our lives. Sometimes, it takes a storm for peace to come. Remember, Jesus is in the boat with us, and that makes all the difference. I ask you to join together in sharing this mighty good news, too good to be true news of Jesus' unconditional love. Tell your friends. A bishop of mine used to say, of all people, Episcopalians would not hesitate for a minute sharing with their friends a good new barbecue sauce they discovered, but based on the numbers, the average Episcopalian invites someone to church once every 26 years. Where's the good news in your life? And how could you share it? It's all in God's hands. Jesus is with us. We're in God's hands. And there's nothing to be afraid of. Thank you for being the church.